door slammed somewhere above her, and Elena Voss felt her whole body go still. She stood in the marble hallway of Ashford Manor in her wedding dress, the silk still cool against her skin, and listened to the sound of her husband's footsteps fading into nothing. 6 hours. She had been married for 6 hours, and already the man she married was gone. She did not chase him. She did not call out his name. She had learned, even in those first 6 hours of marriage, that chasing Kaelan Ashford would only humiliate her further, and she had already been humiliated enough for one lifetime. The manor around her was still full of noise. Somewhere behind the heavy oak doors at the end of the hall, the wedding guests continued their celebration, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the groom had vanished from his own reception. Music drifted faintly through the walls, laughter rose and fell, glasses clinked together in toasts to a marriage that had already ended before it truly began. Elena pressed her palm flat against the cold stone wall to steady herself. Her heart was pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. She had known, from the very first moment she agreed to this marriage, that it was a political arrangement, a treaty written in flesh and vows rather than ink. She had known that Kaelan Ashford, Alpha King of the Ashford territory, did not love her. But she had believed, foolishly perhaps, that respect might be enough to build something real between them, given time. She had not expected him to leave in the middle of their wedding night to chase the scent of another woman across a crowded ballroom. A young maid named Clara approached from the shadows near the staircase, her steps hesitant, her eyes fixed on the floor rather than on Elena's face. In her trembling hands, she carried a folded piece of paper, the wax seal of the Ashford family pressed into its corner. She held it out without a word, as though speaking might somehow make the moment worse than it already was. Elena took the note. Her fingers did not shake, though everything inside her felt as though it might shatter into 1,000 pieces the moment she was alone. She unfolded the paper slowly, the way her father had once taught her to handle important documents, careful never to tear the creases. The words were brief and cold. Kaelan Ashford had detected the presence of his fated mate somewhere within the manor grounds, a discovery that, according to ancient wolf law, took precedence over any political arrangement, no matter how recently sworn. He had gone to find her. He did not know when he would return. The note ended with a single line that Elena would remember for the rest of her life. The pack's business could not wait for sentiment. Sentiment, as though the vows they had spoken only hours earlier had been nothing more than sentiment, easily discarded the moment something more convenient presented itself. Elena folded the note back along its original creases and tucked it into the bodice of her dress, against her heart, where the parchment would remain hidden beneath layers of silk and lace for the rest of the evening. She did not cry. She refused to let herself cry. Not here, not in this hallway, not where anyone from the Ashford household might see her fall apart. Footsteps echoed from the far end of the corridor, heavier and more deliberate than Clara's had been. Elena straightened her spine and turned to find Vivian Ashford approaching, flanked by 2 silent guards whose eyes carefully avoided her gaze. Vivian's silver hair was pinned in an elegant twist, not a single strand out of place, and her expression carried the same icy composure it always did, as though nothing in the world could ever truly disturb her. Vivian did not offer condolences. She did not acknowledge, even briefly, that her son had abandoned his bride on their wedding night in front of the entire pack. She simply informed Elena, in a voice as flat and final as a closing door, that she would need to vacate the manor by sunrise. The marriage had served its purpose. The treaty between the 2 territories had been signed and witnessed. Anything beyond that had never been part of the arrangement, and Vivian made it clear she had no intention of pretending otherwise. Elena listened without interrupting, her hands clasped tightly in front of her to keep them from trembling. When Vivian finished speaking, Elena asked only one question. She asked whether Kaelan had known, before the ceremony began, that this would happen. She asked whether he had stood at the altar and spoken his vows, already knowing he intended to leave her the moment the opportunity arose. Vivian's silence was answer enough. The older woman's expression did not change, but the pause before she finally spoke told Elena everything she needed to know. It did not matter, Vivian said eventually, whether Kaelan had known or not. What mattered was that he had made his choice, and Elena would need to make peace with the consequences. Elena did not argue. She had learned, over the past several months of arranged courtship, that arguing with Vivian Ashford accomplished nothing except giving the woman more reasons to look down on her. Instead, she asked for two things only: her father's locket, which had been placed in a jewelry box in the room she had been assigned for the wedding night, and transportation to the edge of the territory by morning. Vivian granted both requests without hesitation, clearly relieved that Elena intended to leave quietly, rather than cause a scene that might embarrass the family further. That night, alone in a guest chamber far removed from the marital suite she had been meant to share with her new husband, Elena removed her wedding dress with careful, deliberate movements. She did not tear the delicate lace. She did not throw the dress across the room in the kind of dramatic gesture that might have felt satisfying in the moment. She folded it instead, smoothing out each wrinkle with the same steady hands that had folded the note earlier that evening, and packed it into the bottom of her single suitcase. She told herself she was keeping the dress only because it had been expensive, because throwing away something so costly would be wasteful. But some quieter part of her, a part she did not yet fully understand, knew the truth was more complicated than that. She wanted, somehow, to remember this night in full, not as a blur of humiliation she tried desperately to forget, but as a clear and specific memory she could look back on someday, from a place of strength rather than pain. She sat on the edge of the narrow guest bed for a long while, staring at nothing, replaying the events of the day over and over in her mind. She remembered the way Kalen had looked at the altar, his eyes fixed somewhere over her shoulder, rather than on her face, as though he were already searching the crowd for someone else, even as he spoke his vows to her. She remembered the brief, polite smile he had offered during their first dance, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. She remembered thinking, even then, that something felt wrong, though she had told herself it was simply nerves, simply the natural anxiety of marrying a man she barely knew. She thought about her father, Edmund Voss, who had died 2 years earlier, after a long illness that drained both his health and the family's modest savings. He had been a good man, a gentle man, entirely unprepared for the world of pack politics that Elena found herself thrust into after his death. The marriage to Kalen Ashford had been arranged by distant relatives, eager to secure some benefit from the Voss family name, before it disappeared entirely, a name that carried little weight among wolves, but had once meant something in the human business world her father had built from nothing. Elena had agreed to the marriage not out of romantic hope, but out of practicality. She had nothing left after her father's death, except a small inheritance, and a fierce, stubborn will to survive. The marriage had promised security, a place within a powerful pack, protection from the kind of poverty that had haunted her final years caring for her father. She had told herself that love was not necessary, that respect and stability would be enough. Now, sitting alone in a stranger's guest room with a folded note pressed against her heart, she understood how naive that belief had been. By the time the first gray light of dawn began creeping through the curtains, Elena had not slept at all. She rose, dressed in simple traveling clothes she had brought for the journey after the wedding, clothes meant for a honeymoon that would now never happen, and carried her single suitcase down the same marble hallway where her marriage had effectively ended only hours after it began. The manor was silent in the early morning. The celebration long since ended, the guests either departed or sleeping off the wine from the reception. Elena walked through corridors she had only begun to learn, past portraits of Ashford ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to follow her with the same cold judgment Vivian had shown her the night before. She did not look back at the manor once she stepped outside into the cool morning air. A car waited for her at the front steps, exactly as Vivian had promised, driven by a silent guard, who did not attempt conversation during the long drive to the edge of the territory. Elena watched the landscape pass by the window, forests giving way to rolling hills, the Ashford lands stretching further than she had ever fully appreciated during her brief time as a bride within their borders. She thought, distantly, that she would likely never see any of it again. The car dropped her at the boundary marker where pack territory ended and the human world began, a simple stone pillar standing at the edge of a paved road that led toward the distant lights of the city. Elena stood beside her suitcase for a long moment, watching the car turn back the way it had come, disappearing around a bend in the road until the sound of its engine faded entirely into silence. She was alone, truly alone, in a way she had not been even during the loneliest months of caring for her dying father. She had no home to return to, no family waiting for news of how the wedding had gone, no friends close enough to call with the humiliating truth of what had happened. She had only herself, a suitcase containing a folded wedding dress and a folded note, and a locket that had belonged to her father resting against her collarbone. She picked up her suitcase and began walking toward the city, because there was nothing else to do, because standing still accomplished nothing, and because some stubborn, unbroken part of her refused to simply sit down on the side of the road and give up. The walk took nearly 3 hours. By the time she reached the outskirts of the city, her feet ached and her traveling shoes had begun to rub blisters into her heels, but she did not stop to rest. She kept moving, drawn forward by nothing more specific than the vague hope that somewhere in this sprawling, indifferent city, she might find a place to start over. She found that place above a small laundromat on a quiet side street, a narrow room with a single window and a mattress that smelled faintly of detergent. The laundromat's owner, a practical, weathered woman named Margaret Doyle, took one look at Elena standing in her doorway with a suitcase and hollow, exhausted eyes, and did not ask a single question about what had brought her there. She only asked whether Elena could work, and Elena said yes, before Margaret had even finished asking. That first night in the small room above the laundromat, Elena unpacked her suitcase slowly. She hung the folded wedding dress in the narrow closet, where it would remain untouched for years. She placed the folded note in the single drawer of a battered nightstand, where it would stay hidden beneath old receipts and spare buttons for just as long. She kept the locket around her neck, where it had remained every single day since her father's death, and where it would remain for years still to come. She lay down on the narrow mattress, staring up at a water-stained ceiling, and allowed herself, finally, to cry. Not the loud, dramatic tears of heartbreak she might have expected from herself, but quiet, exhausted tears that came from somewhere deeper than simple sadness, a grief for the life she had expected to have, and the life she now faced instead, uncertain and frightening, and entirely her own to build from nothing. She cried until she had no tears left, and then she wiped her face, and she made herself a single promise in the darkness of that unfamiliar room. She promised herself that she would never again allow herself to feel as powerless as she had felt standing in that marble hallway, listening to the sound of a door closing above her. She did not know yet how she would keep that promise. She only knew, with a certainty that surprised her, that she intended to keep it no matter what it cost her. The next morning, she began working at the laundromat before the sun had fully risen, folding other people's clothes for a few coins an hour, learning the rhythms of a life entirely different from anything she had known before. She did not think about Kaylin Ashford, not consciously, not if she could help it. She focused instead on the small, immediate tasks in front of her, one load of laundry at a time, one day at a time, building something new out of the ashes of everything she had lost. She did not know, in those early weeks, that the promise she had made to herself in the dark would carry her further than she ever imagined possible. She did not know that the small, determined spark she felt igniting inside her chest that first night would grow, over the coming years, into something powerful enough to reshape not only her own life, but the lives of everyone connected to the man who had abandoned her. She only knew, as she folded her first stack of laundry in that unfamiliar city, that she was still standing, and that for now, that would have to be enough. On her third day working at the laundromat, an older customer named Ruth Bailey came in with a basket of her late husband's shirts, unable to bring herself to wash them alone. Elena, noticing the woman's trembling hands, quietly took over the entire load without being asked, folding each shirt with the same careful attention she had once given her own wedding dress. Ruth watched her work in silence, and when Elena finally handed the folded shirts back, Ruth simply said that Elena had kind hands, for someone who looked like she was carrying something heavy of her own. Elena said nothing in response, but she thought about that small comment for days afterward, turning it over in her mind, the way she turned over every unexpected kindness in those early, difficult weeks, unused to receiving anything from strangers without a hidden cost attached. Margaret noticed the exchange from behind the counter and said nothing about it either, though later that evening, after closing, she set a bowl of soup in front of Elena, without explanation, and told her to eat before she went upstairs. It was the first warm meal Elena had eaten since arriving in the city, and though she did not cry in front of Margaret, she thought, quietly, that perhaps the world was not entirely made of people like Vivian Ashford after all. Perhaps there were still people who gave without expecting something equal in return, and perhaps, if she paid close enough attention, she might learn to become one of them again herself one day, once the rawest part of the wound had finally scarred over. The weeks that followed blurred together into a single, exhausting rhythm. Elena woke before dawn each morning to help Margaret Doyle open the laundromat, sorting through baskets of strangers' clothes, learning which stains needed cold water and which needed heat, which fabrics could withstand a hard scrub, and which required a gentler hand. Her fingers grew raw from the detergent. Her back ached from hours spent bent over folding tables. She did not complain, not once, because complaining required an energy she could not spare. She ate simply, spent nothing she did not absolutely need to spend, and slept on the narrow mattress above the laundromat, with the sounds of the city drifting through her single window. Some nights, the noise of traffic and distant sirens kept her awake long after exhaustion should have pulled her under. On those nights, she would lie still in the darkness and think, briefly, about the wedding dress folded in her closet, about the note hidden in her nightstand drawer, and she would remind herself, quietly and firmly, that she had made a promise to herself in this very room, and that she intended to keep it. Margaret noticed things about Elena that Elena herself had not yet noticed. She noticed the way Elena added up the day's earnings in her head before Margaret had even reached for the calculator, always arriving at the correct total faster and more accurately than the machine itself. She noticed how Elena reorganized the laundromat's supply orders within her first month, cutting costs on detergent and fabric softener by nearly a third simply by comparing prices across 3 different suppliers that Margaret had never bothered to research. It was Margaret who first suggested, almost as an offhand remark while they closed up one evening, that Elena might have a talent for numbers worth developing properly. She mentioned a bookkeeping course offered at the community college 2 streets over, evening classes designed for people who worked full days and could only study after dark. Elena laughed off the suggestion the first time Margaret raised it, certain she had neither the time nor the money for something like formal education. But the idea stayed with her longer than she expected. She found herself thinking about it during the long hours folding laundry, turning the possibility over in her mind, the way she once turned over the pages of her father's business ledgers as a young girl, fascinated even then by the way numbers could tell a story if you knew how to read them properly. A week later, without telling Margaret her intentions, she walked into the admissions office of the community college and asked what it would take to enroll in the evening bookkeeping program. The answer was more money than she had, but not so much more that it felt entirely impossible. She took on a second job that same week, cleaning offices downtown after midnight, 3 hours a night, 5 nights a week, for a modest wage that, combined with her earnings from the laundromat, was just enough to cover both her rent and her tuition if she was careful with every remaining dollar. For the next 2 years, Elena slept perhaps 4 hours most nights. She worked the laundromat each morning, attended evening classes twice a week, and cleaned office buildings in the hours between midnight and dawn, studying on the bus between locations, reviewing notes during her brief breaks, memorizing formulas and accounting principles in the quiet hour before the sun rose and her next shift began. She did not date. She did not socialize beyond brief, polite exchanges with coworkers and classmates. She built her entire existence around the singular goal of proving, to herself more than anyone else, that she could rebuild a life worth living from absolutely nothing. There were nights when the exhaustion nearly broke her resolve entirely. She remembered one night in particular, during her second winter alone in the city, when a persistent cough kept her from sleeping, and a stack of unpaid bills sat waiting on her small kitchen table. She had sat on the floor of her narrow room that night, her back pressed against the wall beneath the window, staring at the drawer where she kept Kaylin's note, and for the first time since leaving Ashford territory, she had genuinely considered giving up. She did not open the drawer that night. She sat with the temptation, acknowledged it honestly, and then, slowly, talked herself back from the edge of despair the same way she talked herself through every difficult problem in her accounting coursework, one small, manageable step at a time. She reminded herself that she had survived worse nights than this one. She reminded herself of the promise she had made standing in this very room, months earlier, and she told herself that breaking that promise now, over exhaustion and a stack of overdue bills, would mean that everything she had already endured had been for nothing. She got up off the floor eventually. She made herself a cup of tea with the last of her supplies, and she opened her textbook, and she studied until the sun rose, because studying was something she could control, and control was the only thing that made the uncertainty of her new life feel survivable. She graduated from the bookkeeping program with the highest marks in her class, a fact that surprised no one who had watched her work throughout the 2 years, but which still felt, to Elena herself, like an almost unbelievable accomplishment. Her instructor, an older man who rarely praised anyone, told her plainly that she had a mind built for finance, a natural instinct for patterns and numbers that could not be taught, only refined. Elena thanked him quietly, unwilling to let herself feel too much pride, because pride, she had learned, made the inevitable disappointments of life hurt even more when they came. Her first real job came through a posting she found on the community college's job board, an entry-level accounting position at a small firm downtown, run by a sharp, no-nonsense man named Henry Doyle, no relation to Margaret despite sharing her surname, a coincidence Elena noticed but never mentioned. The firm handled bookkeeping and tax preparation for a modest roster of local businesses, nothing glamorous, but steady, honest work that paid considerably better than folding laundry or cleaning offices at midnight. Elena approached the job the same way she approached everything since leaving Ashford territory, with a level of focus and dedication that quickly set her apart from her coworkers. She arrived early. She stayed late. She volunteered for the tedious tasks no one else wanted, the reconciliations and audits that required hours of careful, detailed work, because she had discovered that these were exactly the tasks where mistakes hid, and finding those mistakes before anyone else did was where her true value lay. Within her first 3 months at the firm, Elena discovered a discrepancy in the accounts of one of the firm's largest clients, a pattern of small, carefully hidden transfers that, when traced back far enough, revealed an employee embezzling funds over a period of nearly 2 years. She brought the discovery to her direct supervisor, a cautious man who initially dismissed her concerns as a simple bookkeeping error. Elena, certain of what she had found, took the unusual step of bringing her findings directly to Henry Doyle himself, risking her supervisor's anger in order to ensure the matter received the attention it deserved. Henry Doyle reviewed her evidence personally and found it airtight. The embezzlement was confirmed, the employee was terminated and faced legal consequences, and the firm avoided what could have become a devastating lawsuit from the client involved. Elena's supervisor took much of the credit in his official report to Henry, a slight Elena noticed but chose not to fight, understanding instinctively that some battles were not worth the energy required to win them. But Henry Doyle remembered exactly whose diligence had actually uncovered the fraud, and from that point forward, he began giving Elena increasingly difficult assignments, testing the limits of her abilities with each new challenge. Henry became, over the following 2 years, something close to a mentor, though neither of them ever used that particular word aloud. He sent Elena to negotiate directly with difficult clients twice her age, men and women who initially dismissed her because of her youth and her gender, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by her calm, methodical arguments and her refusal to be rattled by condescension or intimidation. She learned, through these negotiations, that confidence did not require volume, that the calmest, most patient person in any room usually walked away with the better outcome. It was during this period that Elena began to understand something fundamental about the business world that would shape the rest of her career. She noticed that struggling companies were rarely struggling because they lacked potential. More often, they were struggling because of mismanagement, hidden inefficiencies, or leadership too invested in old habits to recognize when change had become necessary. She began, in her spare time, studying failing local businesses the way she had once studied her father's ledgers, looking for patterns of untapped value hiding beneath layers of poor decisions. 2 years into her position at Henry Doyle's firm, Elena used her modest savings, combined with a small loan she secured through careful negotiation with a local bank willing to take a chance on her strong credit history and steady employment record, to purchase a struggling shipping company that Henry himself had once dismissed as essentially worthless. The previous owners had let the business decay through years of neglect, but Elena saw immediately what others had missed: a loyal, experienced workforce, a client base that remained surprisingly stable despite years of poor management, and a fleet of vehicles that needed only modest investment to return to full efficiency. She restructured the company from the ground up over the course of 8 intense months, working her full-time job during the day and managing the shipping company's operations in every spare hour she had remaining. She renegotiated supplier contracts, streamlined delivery routes using logistics principles she taught herself through library books and online research, and replaced 2 underperforming managers with younger employees who had been quietly excelling without recognition under the previous ownership. Within 8 months, the shipping company had returned to profitability for the first time in nearly 3 years. Elena sold it to a larger regional logistics firm for 4 times what she had originally paid, a profit substantial enough to allow her to leave her position at Henry Doyle's firm and pursue business restructuring full-time. Henry, rather than resenting her departure, congratulated her warmly, telling her that he had known from the very first month she worked for him that she would eventually outgrow the modest scope of his small accounting practice. Elena used the profits from the shipping company to purchase a second failing business, then a third, each acquisition slightly larger and more ambitious than the last. She developed a reputation, slowly and then rapidly, as someone with an almost uncanny ability to identify struggling companies with genuine potential, rebuild them efficiently, and either sell them for significant profit or retain them as steadily profitable additions to her growing portfolio. By the time she turned 28, 5 years after walking away from Ashford Manor with nothing but a suitcase and a folded note, Elena had founded Voss Dynamics, a firm that specialized in identifying undervalued or mismanaged businesses, restructuring them from the ground up, and turning them into sustainable, profitable enterprises. She named the company after her father, a quiet tribute to the man who had first taught her to see value in numbers other people overlooked. She was good at this work, exceptionally good, because she understood something that most investors and business analysts did not fully grasp. She understood, on a deeply personal level, what it felt like to be dismissed, to be treated as though your worth had already been decided by someone else before you ever had the chance to prove otherwise. She looked for the same qualities in struggling businesses that she recognized in herself 5 years earlier, untapped potential hiding beneath layers of neglect, waiting for someone patient enough and stubborn enough to see it clearly and bring it back to life. She never remarried during those 5 years. She was never seen publicly with anyone in any serious capacity, a fact that fueled quiet speculation among the business circles she increasingly moved within. Rumors followed her success the way rumors always follow women who achieve significant power, without offering easy explanations for their private lives. But Elena allowed the rumors to exist without correction. She had learned, through hard experience, that some questions did not deserve answers, and that explaining herself to satisfy other people's curiosity was a waste of energy she preferred to spend elsewhere. She kept her father's locket close at all times, resting against her collarbone on a simple chain she never removed, not even during business meetings, where jewelry of any kind was generally considered inappropriate for someone in her position. She kept the folded note from her wedding night in a drawer of her office desk, though she had not opened it in years, had not needed to open it, because she remembered every single word without needing to look at the paper again. She built Voss Dynamics into a name that made experienced executives nervous the moment it appeared attached to an unsolicited offer, because everyone in the business world eventually heard the same underlying story about her methods. When Voss Dynamics expressed interest in a company, it generally meant that company's current leadership had exhausted every other viable option. Elena did not particularly enjoy the fear her reputation inspired among struggling business owners, but she did not mind it either. Fear, she had come to understand through years of hard-won experience, was simply a form of respect, offered by people who had nothing softer left to give. 5 years passed this way, brick by careful brick, hour by exhausting hour, until the frightened young bride, who had once folded a wedding dress into a single suitcase, no longer existed in any form recognizable from the outside. In her place stood a woman who walked into boardrooms the way soldiers walk onto a battlefield, prepared for any contingency, unafraid of confrontation, and utterly unwilling to be caught without a clear and decisive plan. She thought about Kalen Ashford rarely during those years, or at least she told herself she thought about him rarely, training her mind with the same discipline she applied to every other aspect of her rebuilt life, to avoid dwelling on memories that served no productive purpose. But on certain quiet nights, when her office had emptied and the city lights blurred together beyond her window, she found herself wondering, briefly and against her own better judgment, what had become of the Alpha King who had abandoned her, and whether he ever thought, even once, of the woman he had left standing alone in a marble hallway, with nothing but a folded note and a promise to herself that she intended to keep. She did not know, during those quiet moments of wondering, that a company bearing his family's name was quietly collapsing under the weight of hidden betrayals she could not yet imagine, or that the only firm in the region capable of saving it from complete financial ruin belonged, entirely and completely, to her. There had been one man, briefly, during her 4th year of building Voss Dynamics, a quiet architect named Daniel Hart, who had pursued her patiently for several months before she finally agreed to a single dinner. He was kind, steady, entirely unconnected to the world of PACs and politics that had once broken her so completely. For a short while, Elena allowed herself to imagine a version of her future that included him, a version built on ordinary human comforts rather than relentless ambition. But she found, 3 dinners in, that she could not fully open herself to him, that some essential part of her remained locked away behind a door she was not yet ready to unlock for anyone. She ended things gently, honestly, telling him only that she was not ready, and he accepted her answer with a grace that made her respect him even more as she watched him go. She did not regret the decision. She simply recognized, with the same clear-eyed honesty she applied to every failing business she rebuilt, that some wounds required more time to heal than others, and that forcing the process would only cause deeper damage in the long run. She threw herself back into her work after that, growing Voss Dynamics with a focus that left little room for anything else. She acquired a textile company on the verge of bankruptcy and turned it profitable within a year. She rescued a family-owned bakery chain from a hostile takeover by a larger competitor, restructuring its debt so skillfully that the original owners were able to retain a meaningful stake even after her involvement. Each success added another brick to the fortress she had built around herself, and though the fortress kept her safe, she sometimes wondered, in her rare, quiet moments, whether it had also begun to keep her permanently alone. Kalen Ashford stood at the window of his office on the top floor of Ashford Tower, watching the gray morning light spread slowly over the city below, and felt, for perhaps the 100th time that month, the particular weight of watching everything his family had built teeter on the edge of collapse. Behind him, his assistant Owen Blake waited near the door, a leather folder pressed against his chest, reluctant to speak until Kalen turned to face him. The numbers inside that folder were worse than either of them had expected even a week earlier. Ashford Holdings, the company Kalen's grandfather had founded and his father had expanded into one of the most respected names in the region, stood 6 weeks away from defaulting on a loan that could unravel 3 generations of careful work in a matter of months. The failed alliance with the Marlow territory, an alliance Kalen had personally championed against the advice of several senior advisors, had drained resources the company could not afford to lose. Worse still, the public scandal surrounding his former mate's family had frightened away 3 major investors within the span of a single devastating month. Kalen finally turned from the window and asked Owen, in a voice carefully controlled to hide the exhaustion beneath it, what options remained. Owen, who had worked at Kalen's side for nearly a decade and had earned the right to speak plainly, even when the truth was unwelcome, told him there was essentially only one path forward. A private equity firm called Voss Dynamics had expressed interest in acquiring a controlling stake in Ashford Holdings, offering enough capital to clear the outstanding debt and stabilize operations immediately. But the terms attached to the offer were unusually strict, and the firm's reputation suggested very little room for negotiation. Kalen asked what Owen knew about this firm and its leadership. Owen admitted he knew surprisingly little beyond the reputation that preceded it, a reputation built on a string of successful turnarounds and a CEO who, according to every account Owen had gathered, never negotiated terms once an offer had been presented. She reviewed a struggling company, made her decision, and expected an answer within 72 hours, take it or leave it. Something about the name Voss Dynamics made the back of Kalen's neck prickle, in a way he could not immediately explain, a faint unease he attributed, in the moment, simply to the stress of the situation. He told Owen to arrange the meeting regardless. Pride, he had come to understand over the past several difficult months, was a luxury his family's legacy could no longer afford. That evening, alone in the same manor where, 5 years earlier, he had left a young bride standing in a marble hallway without a single word of explanation, Kalen found himself unable to focus on the paperwork spread across his desk. He rarely allowed himself to dwell on the memory of that particular night, having spent 5 years constructing an existence built almost entirely around avoidance. filling every waking hour with pack obligations and business responsibilities so thoroughly that there was no remaining space for memory to intrude. But lately, the memory had been finding cracks in that careful construction, slipping through, at unexpected moments, with a persistence that unsettled him. His fated mate, Celine Marlowe, the woman he had abandoned his own wedding to pursue, had turned out to be nothing resembling the promise the mate bond had seemed to offer that night. Within the first year of their union, Celine's ambition revealed itself as something considerably colder than genuine affection. She had wanted his title, his territory, and the influence that came with the Ashford name, not Kaelan himself. And by the time their relationship finally, painfully ended, he had lost far more than he cared to fully acknowledge, including much of his certainty about what the mate bond was truly meant to signify. His mother, Vivian Ashford, had orchestrated the entire disaster from its very beginning, though Kaelan did not yet understand the full extent of her involvement, or how deliberately she had engineered every part of that catastrophic night. He knew only that the marriage to Elena Voss had been arranged for political convenience, between two territories seeking stability, that the sudden discovery of his supposed fated mate had arrived at a suspiciously convenient hour, and that he had been young enough and certain enough of ancient traditions to never seriously question any of it at the time it happened. He thought of Elena more often than he ever allowed himself to admit aloud, even in the privacy of his own mind. He remembered the quiet dignity she had carried throughout their brief courtship and wedding ceremony, the way she had never once flinched when his mother made cutting, dismissive remarks about her human blood in front of assembled pack members. He remembered the way she had looked at him during the ceremony itself, her expression carrying something that, in retrospect, looked remarkably like genuine hope that their marriage might succeed despite its political origins. He had never forgotten the particular sound the door made as he left her that night, a sound that had followed him quietly through 5 years, persistent as a heartbeat that was not entirely his own. He did not know where she had gone after his mother sent her away from Ashford lands. He had asked, once, during the first difficult year following his own disastrous relationship with Celine, and Vivian had told him only that Elena had returned to the human world where she supposedly belonged, her tone making clear she considered the matter entirely closed. He had not asked again after that single conversation, telling himself repeatedly that it was better not to know, that whatever guilt he already carried would only grow heavier with additional information he could do nothing to change. The morning of the scheduled meeting arrived beneath a heavy gray sky that matched the tension building steadily in Kaelan's chest, a tension he attributed entirely to the company's ongoing financial crisis. He dressed with careful precision, reviewed the merger terms Owen had prepared overnight, and told himself firmly that whoever this reclusive Voss Dynamics CEO turned out to be, he would remain composed, professional, and entirely focused on securing the best possible outcome for his family's legacy, regardless of whatever demands she brought to the negotiating table. Nothing in those careful preparations had readied him for the moment the boardroom doors finally opened. Elena Voss walked into the room, wearing a charcoal suit that fit like carefully constructed armor, her dark hair pulled back in a severe style that left absolutely nothing about her expression available to hide behind. She carried a slim leather folder tucked beneath one arm, and her presence seemed to fill the entire room before she had spoken a single word. For one long, suspended moment, Kaelan found himself completely unable to move, unable to breathe properly, unable to process what his own eyes were telling him. The woman standing in that doorway was unmistakably the same young bride he had abandoned in a marble hallway 5 years earlier, and yet she was also, unmistakably, someone entirely new, someone he did not recognize at all beneath the surface familiarity of her features. Elena's eyes met his across the room, without the faintest flicker of surprise crossing her expression. She had known precisely who she would encounter in this boardroom, well before she ever walked through its doors, her team having thoroughly briefed her on Ashford Holdings' leadership during their preparation for this meeting. She had spent the entire drive across the city rehearsing exactly how she intended to conduct herself, repeating silently that she would absolutely not allow old wounds to interfere with sound business judgment, no matter how unexpectedly they resurfaced. Kaelan found his voice before anyone else in the room, though it emerged rougher and less controlled than he had intended. He said her name as though it were a question, as if speaking it aloud might somehow confirm or disprove what his own eyes were insisting was true. Elena did not answer the unspoken question buried within his tone. She simply opened her leather folder, laid out the precise terms of her proposed merger with clinical, unhurried precision, and addressed him exactly as she would address any other struggling client, as Mr. Ashford, current CEO of a company in significant and worsening financial distress. The other executives seated around the long table exchanged uncertain glances, sensing an unspoken history between the two principals that neither Elena nor Kaylin acknowledged directly. Owen Blake, observing quietly from his position near the corner of the room, recognized immediately that something significant was happening beneath the surface of this meeting, though he said nothing, choosing instead to simply watch and try to understand exactly what he was witnessing unfold. Elena outlined her offer in a voice that never once wavered from its measured, professional tone. Voss Dynamics would acquire a 60% controlling stake in Ashford Holdings, an investment substantial enough to immediately clear the company's outstanding debt and stabilize its increasingly precarious finances. In exchange, she would install her own carefully selected team across several key leadership positions, restructure the company's operations comprehensively from the ground up, and retain final decision-making authority over any major business decisions for a period of 3 years. Kaylin would technically remain in place as CEO, but Elena Voss would be the one actually running Ashford Holdings in every meaningful respect. Kaylin listened to every word of her presentation, but his thoughts kept circling back, again and again, to the woman delivering these devastating terms with such complete composure. This was not the soft-spoken, hopeful young bride he remembered from 5 years earlier, the one who had tried so earnestly to be gracious toward a family that had never truly wanted her presence among them. This Elena spoke with the calm, deliberate precision of someone who had learned, through hard and painful experience, that hesitation cost real money, and that mercy, in business as in life, often cost far more than most people were prepared to pay. He found himself feeling both deeply unsettled and, despite every instinct urging him not to feel anything at all in this moment, quietly and unexpectedly impressed by the transformation standing before him. When Elena finished delivering her presentation, she closed her leather folder with a soft, decisive click and waited, her expression giving away absolutely nothing, for Kaylin's response. He requested a brief moment alone with his advisors, and Elena granted the request without any visible objection, stepping out into the hallway with the same effortless composure she had maintained throughout the entire meeting. Owen found her there several minutes later, standing quietly beside a window that overlooked the sprawling city below. He introduced himself with careful politeness, keenly aware that whatever history clearly existed between his employer and this formidable woman was not his place to inquire about directly. Elena shook his offered hand with practiced professionalism and said nothing whatsoever about their shared past, though Owen noticed the brief, almost unconscious way her fingers brushed against a small locket resting at her throat, before she let her hand fall naturally back to her side. Inside the boardroom, Kaylin's remaining advisors argued among themselves that the proposed terms were undeniably harsh but ultimately survivable, and that no other firm in the region had offered anything remotely close to a viable alternative solution. Kaylin barely absorbed a word of their heated discussion. He kept replaying, over and over, the exact moment Elena had walked through those doors, the complete and total absence of hesitation in her steady eyes, the way she had looked at him, as though he were simply one more obstacle standing between her and a favorable business outcome, nothing more significant than that. He asked his advisors to leave him alone in the room for a few minutes to think. Once the space had emptied completely, he sat in heavy silence, staring at the door through which Elena had exited, trying desperately to reconcile the gentle young woman he remembered with the formidable businesswoman who had just outlined terms that would strip him of nearly all meaningful control over his own family's company, without offering a single hint of personal feeling in her carefully measured voice. Some part of him, buried deep beneath years of accumulated guilt and deliberate denial, recognized clearly that he likely deserved every bit of the coldness she had just shown him. He had left her without any real explanation. He had allowed his mother to send her away, without lifting a single finger to intervene or object. He had spent 5 entire years telling himself repeatedly that it was better not to think about what had become of her, and now she had returned into his life not as a wounded, forgotten bride seeking answers or closure, but as the one person who now held complete power over whether his family's legacy survived this crisis or collapsed entirely. When he finally called her back into the boardroom, He agreed to her terms without any further negotiation whatsoever, directly against the strong advice of two of his most senior and experienced advisors. Elena studied his face carefully for a long, searching moment, before nodding once and sliding a formal contract across the polished table for his signature. As he signed his name directly beneath hers on the document, Kaelin felt, for the first time in 5 long years, that the very ground beneath him had shifted in some fundamental way he could not yet fully comprehend or articulate. Elena watched him sign without displaying any visible reaction whatsoever, though somewhere deep inside her, something she had spent 5 careful years deliberately burying stirred quietly, unexpectedly awake. She told herself firmly that this meant absolutely nothing beyond simple business satisfaction. She told herself this was merely the natural result of years of hard work and considerably better decision-making than the man seated across from her had ever managed to demonstrate. She repeated this to herself all the way back down to her waiting car, and she very nearly believed it completely by the time she finally reached the parking garage beneath the tower. Grace Bennett was waiting for her when she arrived back at the small temporary office Voss Dynamics had set up near Ashford Tower. Eager to hear how the negotiation had gone, Elena gave her a brief, factual summary, mentioning nothing of the personal history involved, and Grace, sharp as always, seemed to sense there was more beneath the surface than her employer was willing to share. She did not press the matter, simply noting that the terms Elena had secured were remarkably favorable, and that the team would need to move quickly to begin the transition before the board of Ashford Holdings had time to reconsider. That night, driving home through streets she had walked exhausted and penniless 5 years earlier, Elena found herself gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles pale against the leather. She had promised herself, so many times over so many years, that she would never let Kaelin Ashford affect her again, and yet the mere sight of him across a boardroom table had undone hours of careful preparation in a matter of seconds. She told herself this was simply the natural shock of confronting the past unexpectedly, nothing more significant than that, and she repeated this explanation to herself until she nearly believed it by the time she pulled into her building's garage. That night, in the quiet privacy of her apartment, Elena opened the drawer, where she still kept the folded note from her wedding night, untouched for years. She unfolded it slowly, reading the familiar words one final time, and then, for the first time since the night she originally received it, she allowed herself to cry. Not out of renewed grief, but out of something closer to release, as though a weight she had carried for so long without fully realizing its true size had finally, briefly, begun to lift from her chest. She refolded the note carefully and returned it to its drawer. Tomorrow, she would walk back into Ashford Holdings as its new controlling owner, and she would not allow a single tear from tonight to follow her through those doors. The first week inside Ashford Holdings tested every ounce of composure Elena had carefully built over 5 demanding years. She arrived each morning before sunrise, before even the cleaning staff had finished their rounds, and she left the building long after darkness had fully settled over the city outside. She reviewed every department methodically, every contract, every questionable expense that the previous leadership had allowed to slip through without proper scrutiny. She uncovered wasteful spending in nearly every corner of the sprawling company, and she eliminated each instance without offering a single apology for the disruption it caused. Her arrival sent a visible ripple of anxiety through the entire building. Employees who had worked at Ashford Holdings for decades whispered nervously about the new owner, in hushed, uncertain voices, unsure whether they should fear her methods or quietly admire her evident competence. She dismissed 2 entire department heads within her first 3 days for what her audit revealed as gross financial mismanagement, and she promoted a sharp young analyst named Grace Bennett to oversee the company's financial operations after discovering that Grace had been quietly flagging serious irregularities in internal reports for months, without anyone in leadership bothering to listen. Grace quickly became one of the very few people inside Ashford Holdings whom Elena genuinely trusted. She was sharp, appropriately discreet, and entirely unbothered by the palpable tension that seemed to follow Elena and Kaelin whenever the two of them occupied the same room together. It was Grace who first noticed how carefully Elena avoided ever being alone with Kaelin, always scheduling their necessary meetings with a third party present, always maintaining a desk or conference table firmly between them whenever circumstances allowed. Kaelin noticed this careful avoidance too, though he chose to say nothing about it directly to anyone. He watched Elena move confidently through his own company, with the same quiet, unshakable authority she had first displayed in the boardroom. And every single day he discovered fresh evidence of exactly how completely she had transformed herself over the past 5 years. She spoke to executives twice her age, without displaying the faintest trace of hesitation. She corrected flawed financial projections in real time, during tense meetings, catching errors that experienced senior accountants had entirely missed. She single-handedly rebuilt the company's failing supply chain within just 2 demanding weeks, successfully negotiating better terms with 3 separate vendors who had long taken advantage of Ashford Holdings' obvious financial desperation. During her second week, Elena called a meeting with the entire logistics department, a group of nearly 40 employees who had spent months bracing for layoffs they assumed were inevitable under new ownership. She stood before them, calm and direct, and told them plainly that she had not come to punish anyone for the previous leadership's failures. She had come to fix what was broken, and fixing it required their expertise, not their unemployment. She asked pointed questions about bottlenecks in the delivery process, and when a quiet warehouse supervisor named Peter Lang, no relation to Victor, hesitantly raised his hand with a suggestion he admitted he had proposed twice before without anyone listening, Elena had her team implement it within the week. The change cut delivery delays by nearly a quarter. Word of the meeting spread quickly through the building, and for the first time since her arrival, the whispers about the new owner began to shift from fear toward something closer to cautious respect. He found himself watching her more closely than he intended to admit even to himself. He told himself it was simple curiosity, the natural response anyone might have to watching a person reinvent themselves so thoroughly. But late at night, lying awake in the same manner where he had once left her standing utterly alone, he knew privately that it was something considerably more complicated than mere curiosity, something closer to the guilt he had spent 5 years actively avoiding. One evening, nearly 2 full weeks into their new working arrangement, Kaylin found Elena still seated in her office, long after everyone else had already gone home for the night. She was reviewing a thick stack of contracts under the warm glow of a single desk lamp, her suit jacket draped casually over the back of her chair, her sleeves rolled neatly to her elbows. He stood quietly in the doorway for a long moment, before she finally noticed his presence, and in that brief, unguarded window, he glimpsed something he had not witnessed since their wedding day, a flicker of genuine exhaustion visible beneath the careful armor she wore so consistently during daylight hours. She looked up, and the exhaustion vanished almost instantly, replaced immediately by the same composed distance she maintained around him at every opportunity. He asked if she had eaten dinner yet. She admitted she had not, and before she could politely refuse, he set a warm takeout bag down on the corner of her cluttered desk, food he had picked up on his way back from a separate late meeting, more out of simple habit than any specific romantic intention. Elena stared at the bag for a long, considering moment, before quietly thanking him and returning her attention to the paperwork spread across her desk. Kaylin did not leave immediately. He asked, with genuine and careful curiosity, how she had managed to build Voss Dynamics from absolutely nothing in just 5 short years. It was the very first personal question he had asked her since she had walked back into his life, and for a moment, Elena seriously considered simply refusing to answer him at all. Instead, she offered him a small piece of the truth. She told him briefly about the years spent attending night classes, the 2 demanding jobs she had worked simultaneously, the small failing shipping company she had rebuilt using money she could barely afford to spare. She carefully avoided mentioning the wedding dress still folded away in her old apartment. She avoided mentioning the note still resting quietly in her desk drawer. She kept her answer brief and strictly factual, the same way she answered every question anyone asked about her past, revealing only as much information as felt strictly necessary to satisfy curiosity, without inviting any further, more probing questions. Kaylin listened without interrupting her once, and when she finally finished speaking, he told her quietly that he was sorry, not specifically for any of the sound business decisions she had made since her return, but for everything that had happened long before those decisions became necessary. Elena's expression did not visibly change, but her hands stilled momentarily over the papers spread in front of her. She told him, in a voice carrying neither anger nor forgiveness, that apologies alone could not rebuild 5 entire years, and that she had not returned to Ashford Holdings seeking any kind of apology from him. She had returned because it represented a genuinely sound business decision, and for no other reason beyond that. Kalen accepted this firm answer without arguing further, though something tightened noticeably in his chest at the complete finality carried in her tone. He left her office that night without pushing the conversation any further, but their exchange lingered persistently in his mind for days afterward, replaying itself whenever the building grew quiet enough for memory to intrude. As the following weeks passed steadily, Elena's comprehensive restructuring efforts began producing genuinely impressive results. The company's stock price, which had been in dangerous freefall before her arrival, stabilized completely, and then began a slow, steady, encouraging climb upward. Investors who had previously abandoned Ashford Holdings during the height of the scandal began quietly returning, drawn back by the strong reputation Voss Dynamics had built for successfully turning failing companies into genuinely profitable enterprises. Kalen watched his family's legacy pull back decisively from the very edge of complete collapse, and he understood clearly, without any real question remaining, that it was entirely because of the same woman he had once so carelessly discarded. Not everyone within the company welcomed this significant change with open enthusiasm. A senior board member named Victor Lang, who had served loyally under Kalen's father for several decades, deeply resented the substantial loss of influence that inevitably came with Elena's sudden arrival. He resisted her decisions at nearly every turn, openly questioning her authority during board meetings, and quietly encouraging other executives to follow his lead in doing the same. Elena handled his persistent resistance with the same cold, methodical efficiency she applied to every obstacle she encountered, presenting financial data so thorough and so overwhelmingly clear in her favor that Victor's objections crumbled completely, under close scrutiny, each and every time he attempted to raise them. During one particularly tense board meeting, Victor directly accused Elena of using her newfound position to deliberately punish the entire Ashford family for personal reasons, implying strongly that her restructuring decisions were driven primarily by lingering resentment rather than sound business strategy. The room fell into complete silence, waiting anxiously for her response. Elena did not raise her voice even slightly. She simply pulled up the company's financial records from before her arrival, placed them directly beside the significantly improved figures from her first month of leadership, and calmly asked Victor which set of numbers he genuinely believed better served the interests of the company's shareholders. Victor had no meaningful answer to offer. Kalen, watching quietly from across the table, felt something close to genuine pride swell unexpectedly in his chest, quickly followed by a familiar, persistent wave of guilt. This was the same woman he had once so casually dismissed as merely a political convenience, the woman his own mother had openly called unworthy of carrying the Ashford family name. She had rebuilt an entire business empire from absolutely nothing, while he spent those same 5 years chasing after a mate bond that, he was beginning to suspect, had been built on a foundation of lies he did not yet fully understand. Victor Lang, still smarting from his defeat in the boardroom, sought out Kalen privately a few days later, warning him that allowing Elena Voss this much unchecked authority was a mistake he would eventually regret. He argued that no matter how skilled she was with numbers, she remained an outsider who owed the Ashford family no true loyalty, and that Kalen was foolish to trust her simply because her methods happened to be working. Kalen listened to the older man's concerns respectfully, as he always did, but told him plainly that loyalty built on blind tradition had already nearly destroyed the company once, under his mother's careful guidance, and that he would rather trust competence and honesty from an outsider than misplaced loyalty from someone who had allowed the company to rot from the inside for years without raising an alarm. Victor left the conversation unconvinced, but he did not raise the subject with Kalen again. Late one night, after a particularly difficult negotiation with one of the company's largest remaining creditors, Elena stayed behind alone to finalize the necessary paperwork. Kalen found her again, this time not with food, but with a bottle of wine and 2 glasses, a small gesture of genuine gratitude for the difficult deal she had just successfully secured, one that had saved the company nearly $2 million in potential penalties. She hesitated briefly before accepting a glass, fully aware of how easily small gestures like this one could erode the careful, deliberate distance she had worked so hard to maintain. But sheer exhaustion, combined with something quieter stirring beneath it, made her accept anyway, and for the very first time since her return, they sat together, without discussing business matters, without discussing their shared past, simply existing quietly in the same space, without the accumulated weight of 5 painful years, pressing down on either of them. It did not last particularly long. Elena's phone buzzed suddenly with an urgent message from Grace, flagging a serious irregularity discovered within the company's overseas accounts that could not reasonably wait until the following morning. The peaceful moment shattered instantly, and Elena rose immediately to her feet, thanking Kaylin briefly for the wine, before disappearing back into the version of herself that never allowed anything to slow her down for long. Kaylin sat alone afterward for a long while, staring at the second, entirely untouched glass of wine, wondering privately how many more moments like this one it would ultimately take, before either of them finally admitted aloud what neither seemed fully ready to say out loud yet. The irregularity Grace had flagged turned out to be considerably more serious than either of them had initially expected. Buried deep within Ashford Holdings' overseas accounts was a clear pattern of suspicious transfers that did not match any legitimate business activity. Routed carefully through a shell company registered under a name Elena did not immediately recognize. She spent the following 2 full days tracing the money quietly and methodically, without alerting anyone outside her closest circle of trusted advisors, until the trail eventually led her somewhere she had not anticipated at all. The suspicious transfers connected directly to Celine Marlowe, Kaylin's former fated mate, and to several accounts controlled by various members of her extended family. Elena stared at the mounting evidence for a long time before deciding exactly how to proceed, fully aware that whatever she uncovered next would inevitably pull Kaylin back into a painful chapter of his life he clearly had not yet fully resolved. She requested a private meeting with him early the following morning, well before the rest of the office staff arrived. When she laid the evidence out carefully across his desk and explained precisely what she had discovered, Kaylin's face went visibly pale, in a way Elena had not witnessed since the day she first walked back into his boardroom. He asked her quietly how long these transfers had apparently been happening. Elena told him the earliest transaction she could definitively trace was nearly 4 years old, well before his relationship with Celine had ultimately ended, and well before the public scandal that had nearly destroyed his company's hard-earned reputation entirely. Kaylin sat back heavily in his chair, slowly processing the full implications of what she had just told him. If Celine's family had genuinely been draining money from Ashford Holdings for years under the false guise of a legitimate business partnership, it meant the failed alliance that had nearly bankrupted his company had not been a simple accident or an honest business misjudgment on his part. It had been entirely deliberate, carefully orchestrated from the very beginning, long before the fated mate bond had ever pulled him away from his own wedding night in the first place. Elena watched him carefully as this difficult realization settled fully over him, and despite every protective wall she had spent years building around her feelings for this man, she found herself genuinely unable to remain completely unmoved by the quiet devastation visible in his expression. She told him, with unexpected gentleness, that they would eventually need to bring this evidence to the board and very likely to legal authorities as well, but that she had wanted him to hear it directly from her first, privately, before it inevitably became a matter for lawyers and public headlines to sort through. Kaylin thanked her, his voice noticeably rough with emotion, and for a long moment neither of them spoke another word. The silence stretching between them felt distinctly different than it had during the previous weeks, less guarded and more genuine, though neither of them was quite ready yet to openly acknowledge exactly what had shifted between them. Elena gathered the scattered documents and stood to leave, but Kaylin stopped her gently at the door, asking whether she had already suspected any of this when she first agreed to the original merger. She told him honestly that she had not suspected anything of the sort. She had come purely for the business opportunity, for the numbers, for the genuine challenge of rebuilding something broken from the ground up. She had never expected to uncover the painful truth about the mate bond that had ended their marriage buried inside a set of deliberately falsified financial records. Kaylin nodded slowly, and as Elena walked quietly out of his office, he found himself, for the very first time in 5 long years, genuinely uncertain about nearly everything he had once firmly believed to be true about his own life. News of the financial investigation spread quickly through Ashford Holdings within just a few days, despite Elena's careful attempts to keep the sensitive matter properly contained. Whispers moved steadily through the hallways, employees speculating openly about what this new discovery might mean for the company's uncertain future and for the Ashford family's already fragile public reputation. Elena worked quickly and methodically to control the developing narrative, meeting extensively with legal counsel, and a small team of trusted investigators to build a case strong enough to withstand intense scrutiny before anything went public. Grace Bennett proved absolutely invaluable throughout this difficult period, successfully tracing additional transfers that considerably expanded the known scope of what Celine's family had systematically taken from the company over several years. The final total, once fully and carefully calculated, was genuinely staggering. Enough money to explain not only the failed alliance, but several smaller financial crises Ashford Holdings had weathered over the past 4 years, without anyone ever fully understanding the true underlying cause. Kalen attended every single meeting Elena called during this tense period, though he said relatively little, absorbing each new painful revelation with a heaviness that seemed to grow noticeably heavier with each passing day. He had spent years genuinely believing his judgment regarding Celine had simply been clouded by the mate bond itself, that he had made an honest, understandable mistake, trusting someone the bond had firmly told him was meant specifically for him. Learning that her family had been systematically defrauding his company throughout the entire relationship forced him to seriously reconsider everything he thought he had understood about that entire painful period of his life. Grace worked closely with the investigators during this period, and one evening, staying late to finish tracing a final set of transfers, she found herself talking with Elena about matters entirely unrelated to the case. She admitted, hesitantly, that she had once worked at a smaller firm where a senior manager took credit for her ideas for nearly 2 years before she found the courage to leave. Elena listened carefully, then told her, with unusual openness, that recognizing your own value before anyone else was willing to recognize it was often the hardest and most important skill anyone could learn in business. Grace thanked her for the encouragement, and from that evening forward, something in their working relationship shifted into something closer to genuine friendship, a rare thing for Elena to allow herself given how carefully she generally guarded her personal life from the people she worked alongside. One afternoon, after a particularly long meeting with the company's legal team, Kalen asked Elena to walk with him through the building's rooftop garden, a quiet space he rarely used but which offered a rare moment of genuine privacy, away from the tension filling nearly every other room in the tower. Elena agreed, more out of sheer exhaustion than any particular desire for his company, though she found herself unexpectedly grateful for the fresh air once they stepped outside together. They walked in comfortable silence for a while, before Kalen finally spoke. He told her that he needed to understand something important, and he asked her not to answer as a careful business partner, but simply as herself. He asked why she had agreed to the Voss Dynamics deal at all, knowing full well it meant walking directly back into a company that carried his family's name, and by extension, walking back into daily, unavoidable contact with him personally. Elena considered the difficult question carefully, before finally answering. She told him the truth, or at least the portion of the truth she was willing to share openly. She explained that Ashford Holdings had represented a genuinely sound business opportunity, significantly undervalued, and clearly salvageable. Exactly the kind of struggling company Voss Dynamics specialized in successfully rebuilding. She insisted she had not allowed the past to influence her professional decision, because she had trained herself, over 5 demanding years, never to let personal emotion interfere with sound business judgment. Kalen studied her expression for a long, searching moment, clearly unconvinced, but unwilling to push the matter further. He told her quietly that he genuinely admired the woman she had become, even though he understood he had absolutely no right to say so given everything that had happened between them. Elena did not respond directly to his compliment. She only told him that his admiration meant very little to her anymore, not out of any particular cruelty, but simply because she had learned, through considerable pain, not to build her own sense of self-worth around anyone else's opinion of her, especially his. The words landed harder than she had perhaps intended, and she saw it clearly in the way his jaw tightened noticeably, but she did not soften them or offer any apology. She had spent 5 entire years building careful walls, precisely so that moments exactly like this one would not manage to undo her completely, and she was not willing to let a single rooftop conversation dismantle work that had taken her so long and cost her so much to complete. They returned separately to the office below, and for the remainder of that particular week, Elena buried herself entirely in the ongoing investigation, using the demanding work as a deliberate shield against the growing complexity of her genuine feelings toward the man whose company she now effectively controlled. She told herself repeatedly that whatever unexpected tenderness had crept steadily into their recent conversations was simply the natural result of shared crisis, nothing more permanent than the temporary closeness that inevitably forms between people fighting the exact same difficult battle together. Meanwhile, word of the developing financial scandal began leaking steadily beyond the walls of Ashford Holdings itself. A determined local business journalist named Claire Whitfield picked up on persistent rumors of financial irregularities within the company and began asking increasingly pointed questions during a public industry event, catching Kaylin noticeably off guard in front of several other prominent executives. He handled her difficult questions as carefully as possible, refusing to confirm any specific details before the internal investigation had fully concluded. But the uncomfortable exchange left him visibly rattled, keenly aware that the entire situation was slipping toward complete public exposure, put literally faster than he had adequately prepared for. Elena, informed of the incident within the hour by a concerned member of her communications team, immediately called an emergency meeting with the company's public relations staff and legal counsel to carefully prepare a controlled public statement, one designed to frame Ashford Holdings clearly as the innocent victim of deliberate fraud, rather than as a company mired in scandal of its own careless making. She worked steadily through the entire night crafting the precise language of the statement herself, unwilling to leave something this critically important to anyone she considered less thorough than herself. Kaylin found her in her office again, near midnight that same night, much the same way he had found her weeks earlier, except this time, there was no wine waiting, no gentle personal gesture, only the shared, pressing urgency of protecting something they both, in their own very different ways, desperately needed to survive intact. He offered immediately to help draft the difficult statement, and for the very first time since her return to the company, they worked closely side by side, as genuine equal partners, trading careful edits back and forth between them, each one sharpening the other's natural instincts, until the final document was as strong and defensible as it could possibly be made. Somewhere in the middle of that unusually long night, sheer exhaustion finally wore down the careful, deliberate distance Elena had worked so hard to maintain for weeks. She found herself laughing quietly at something particularly dry that Kaylin said, a small, entirely unguarded sound that genuinely surprised them both equally. He looked at her afterward with an expression she could not immediately name, something caught delicately between relief and quiet longing, and for one brief, suspended moment, neither of them looked away from the other. The tender moment passed as quickly as it had arrived, interrupted suddenly by Grace arriving urgently with fresh information from the ongoing investigation team. Elena straightened immediately, pulling her focus firmly back to the crisis still at hand, but the memory of that brief, unguarded laugh lingered persistently with both of them, long after the final statement had been carefully finalized and sent out to the press early the next morning. The public response to Ashford Holdings' carefully worded statement proved largely sympathetic, successfully framing the company as an innocent victim of calculated deception, rather than as a poorly managed business. Stock prices, which had wavered noticeably during the tense days of public speculation, steadied considerably once the full narrative finally became clear to investors and the general public alike. Elena's swift and remarkably thorough handling of the entire crisis earned quiet respect, even from persistent skeptics like Victor Lang, who found himself, for the very first time since her arrival, entirely without a single meaningful objection to raise during the following scheduled board meeting. But the successful resolution of this particular public crisis did absolutely nothing to resolve the private one, steadily building between Elena and Kaylin beneath the surface. Late one evening, after the investigation had largely concluded and formal legal proceedings against Celine's family had officially begun, Kaylin asked Elena to join him for a quiet dinner, not framed as a business meeting, but as something considerably closer to what they had once shared together, long before everything between them had fallen catastrophically apart. Elena hesitated for a long, considering moment before ultimately declining his invitation. She told him, gently but with clear firmness, that she was not yet ready to revisit whatever had once genuinely existed between them, and that the professional respect which had grown steadily between them throughout these difficult weeks was as far as she felt willing to go for the time being. Kaylin accepted her honest answer without any argument, though the visible disappointment in his eyes proved impossible for him to fully hide from her. Walking alone to her car that particular night, Elena allowed herself, for just a few private minutes, to sit quietly with the full weight of everything she had carefully refused to say to him. She thought about the wedding dress still folded away in her old apartment, the note still resting quietly in her office desk drawer, the many years of profound loneliness she had deliberately built into a protective fortress around her own heart. She was not yet ready to let anyone through those carefully constructed walls, not even a man who had spent the past several difficult weeks slowly and steadily proving that he might genuinely deserve a second chance after all. She drove home that night in complete silence, entirely unaware that somewhere across the sprawling city, Vivian Ashford had just learned about the unfolding scandal involving Celine's family, and was already carefully calculating exactly how to use the resulting chaos to her own considerable advantage before Elena's steadily growing influence over Ashford Holdings became permanently established beyond any hope of challenge. Claire Whitfield, the journalist who had first raised pointed questions about the scandal, requested a follow-up interview once the fraud investigation became public knowledge, hoping to secure an exclusive story about the company's remarkable recovery. Elena agreed to a carefully controlled interview, choosing her words with the same precision she brought to every negotiation. When Claire asked directly about her personal history with Kaylin Ashford, Elena declined to answer, stating simply that her focus remained entirely on the company's financial recovery, and that her personal life was not relevant to the story. Claire respected the boundary, and the resulting article focused entirely on Elena's business acumen, further cementing her growing reputation as one of the sharpest minds in the region's corporate world. Kaylin read the article twice, admiring, not for the first time, how completely Elena controlled every narrative surrounding her, never allowing anyone a foothold into the parts of her life she chose to keep private. Vivian Ashford arrived at the company tower without any prior appointment, dressed in the same commanding elegance she had worn the night she originally sent Elena away 5 long years earlier. She swept confidently past Grace Bennett's desk with barely a passing glance, demanding immediate entry into Elena's office, as though 5 years and an entirely different balance of power had somehow not passed between them since the last time the two women had stood together in the same room. Elena did not rise from her chair when Vivian entered uninvited. She did not offer the older woman a seat. She simply set down her pen, folded her hands calmly atop her desk, and waited patiently, her expression giving away absolutely nothing of the internal storm Vivian's sudden presence stirred beneath her carefully composed surface. Vivian wasted no time whatsoever on empty pleasantries. She accused Elena directly of using the ongoing scandal surrounding Celine's family to seize permanent, unchallenged control of Ashford Holdings, framing the entire legitimate investigation as a calculated personal move designed specifically to humiliate the proud Ashford name once and for all. Elena listened without a single interruption, patiently allowing Vivian to fully exhaust every accusation before finally offering any response of her own. When she finally spoke, her voice remained perfectly level and controlled. She reminded Vivian firmly that the extensive fraud committed against Ashford Holdings had been entirely real, thoroughly documented, and completely independent of anything Elena herself had orchestrated. She reminded Vivian, too, that it had been Ashford Holdings' own leadership, operating under Vivian's direct guidance for decades, that had allowed such extensive fraud to go completely undetected for so many years. If anyone genuinely bore responsibility for the company's obvious vulnerability, Elena stated clearly, it was the very woman standing directly in front of her at this moment. Vivian's composure cracked slightly at that pointed observation, though she recovered quickly, shifting her entire approach. She reminded Elena coldly that the marriage between her and Kaylin had technically never been formally dissolved under proper PAC law, a specific detail Elena already knew well, but had not particularly expected Vivian to raise so directly and immediately. Vivian suggested pointedly that this remaining legal technicality could potentially be used to challenge Elena's current authority over the company, arguing that, as Kaylin's still legal wife, any controlling business interest Elena held could eventually be contested as shared marital property, rather than as a completely separate business acquisition. Elena's expression did not visibly change, but internally, she recognized this particular threat for exactly what it truly was. She had anticipated something along these lines from the very moment she first agreed to the merger, and she had spent the past several weeks quietly ensuring that Voss Dynamics' complete ownership stake was carefully structured in a way that would successfully withstand any potential legal challenge, marital or otherwise. She told Vivian, calmly and without hesitation, that she was entirely welcome to pursue whatever legal action she genuinely believed might succeed, but that she should certainly be prepared for the likely outcome, to reflect quite poorly on the Ashford family's already fragile public standing. Vivian left without offering another word, but Elena understood clearly that this particular confrontation was far from truly over. That same evening, she called an emergency meeting with her entire legal team to carefully review every single contract and filing connected to the merger, determined to close any possible remaining gap that Vivian might attempt to exploit in the near future. Kalen learned of his mother's unexpected visit from Owen, who had personally witnessed Vivian storming furiously through the building's lobby earlier that same afternoon. He found Elena in her office late that night, once again completely surrounded by scattered paperwork, and this time he did not bring wine or takeout food with him. He simply sat quietly across from her and asked her to tell him exactly, word for word, what his mother had said during their confrontation. Elena recounted the entire conversation, without any embellishment whatsoever, watching Kalen's expression darken visibly with every additional detail she shared. When she specifically mentioned the still unresolved marriage, something shifted noticeably in his eyes, a complicated mixture of deep guilt and something else entirely that Elena could not quite immediately identify. He admitted, quietly and with obvious difficulty, that he had never actually filed for a formal legal separation, not because he genuinely believed the marriage still meant anything significant, but because facing the necessary paperwork would have meant fully facing everything he had done to hurt her, and he had spent 5 entire years actively avoiding exactly that painful reckoning. Elena absorbed this difficult admission without any visible reaction, though something in her chest tightened uncomfortably despite her best efforts to remain composed. She told him, in a carefully measured voice, that the current legal state of their marriage was entirely irrelevant to the business arrangement now existing between them, and that she fully intended to keep it that way, regardless of whatever his mother attempted to do next. Kalen did not argue with her directly, but he did not entirely accept her firm dismissal either. He told her that he intended to file for a proper legal dissolution of their marriage immediately, not simply to satisfy his mother's ongoing scheming, but because Elena genuinely deserved to be completely free of any lingering claim the Ashford name still held over her personal life. Elena thanked him quietly for this, though the surprising finality of his words landed with considerably more emotional weight than either of them had fully expected. Over the following several days, Vivian's increasingly aggressive attempts to undermine Elena's growing authority continued to escalate. She reached out privately to several key board members, attempting to rally meaningful support for a formal vote that would challenge Voss Dynamics' controlling stake outright, carefully framing her entire effort as a necessary act of protection for the Ashford family's precious legacy. Victor Lang, despite his own earlier resistance toward Elena's leadership, ultimately refused to support Vivian's determined effort, having genuinely grown to respect the financial stability Elena had successfully brought to the company, even though he still occasionally found her methods somewhat unconventional. Elena, sensing the dangerous political maneuvering steadily building around her, decided to confront the entire issue directly, rather than simply wait for it to escalate further out of control. She called a full board meeting, formally inviting Vivian to attend, and used the public platform to present a complete and detailed account of the company's remarkable turnaround under her leadership, laying out concrete figures that made the genuine value of her involvement impossible for anyone to reasonably dispute. She followed this presentation with a clear, entirely unemotional explanation of Voss Dynamics' formal legal ownership structure, demonstrating conclusively that any challenge based on marital status would inevitably fail under existing contract law, regardless of whatever personal history existed between her and Kalen. Vivian, thoroughly outmaneuvered in front of the very board members she had specifically hoped to rally to her cause, left the meeting with her remaining influence over Ashford Holdings visibly and significantly diminished. Kalen, watching Elena dismantle his mother's entire scheme with the same calm, unwavering precision she brought to every single challenge she faced, felt something settle firmly and permanently in his chest. Not simply admiration, but a growing, undeniable certainty that the remarkable woman seated across the table had become someone he genuinely could not imagine ever losing again. That night, Owen found Kalen still in the boardroom long after everyone else had left, staring at the empty chair where Elena had been sitting only hours earlier. Owen, who rarely spoke about matters beyond company business, told his old friend plainly that he had never seen Kaylin defend anyone the way he had just defended Elena in front of the entire board, not even during the height of his relationship with Celine. Kaylin did not answer immediately. He simply admitted, quietly, that he was beginning to understand the difference between a bond that had been forced upon him by circumstance and a genuine respect that had been earned, slowly and honestly, through 5 years of watching a woman rebuild her entire life, without any help from him at all. Owen clapped him once on the shoulder and told him, with the bluntness of an old friend, that he had better not waste this particular second chance the way he had wasted the first one. After the meeting concluded and the boardroom slowly emptied, Kaylin approached Elena one final time that day. He told her, simply and directly, that he had filed the necessary paperwork to dissolve their marriage that very morning, and that he genuinely did not expect anything from her in return. He said it not as any kind of plea for reconciliation, but as an honest act of respect, a way of finally giving her the complete freedom his own mother had cruelly denied her 5 years earlier. Elena studied him for a long, searching moment, looking for the familiar calculation she had learned to expect from everyone connected to the Ashford name. She found none whatsoever. What she found instead was a quiet, unguarded honesty that reminded her, briefly and rather painfully, of the man she had once genuinely believed she was marrying, before everything between them fell completely apart. She thanked him, her voice remaining steady, and told him she genuinely appreciated the meaningful gesture. She did not tell him that some small part of her, stubborn and buried deep beneath 5 years of carefully constructed armor, felt an unexpected pang of loss at the idea of their marriage finally, formally ending. She kept that particular feeling entirely to herself, filed it away alongside everything else she refused to examine too closely, and returned to her office to finish the remaining work, still waiting patiently on her desk. Celine Marlowe returned to the city 3 tense weeks after the fraud investigation had become fully public, arriving not to answer honestly for her family's extensive actions, but to salvage whatever remaining influence she still believed she held over Kaylin personally. She requested a private meeting through Owen, carefully framing it as a genuine chance to explain her side of the complicated story, though everyone who knew her reasonably well suspected her true motives ran considerably deeper than simple explanation. Kaylin agreed to see her, more out of a genuine need for personal closure than any lingering romantic affection. Elena, informed of the scheduled meeting beforehand purely out of professional necessity, said nothing whatsoever about it, beyond confirming the strict legal boundaries Kaylin needed to carefully maintain during any conversation with someone currently under active criminal investigation. She told herself firmly that the tightness she felt in her chest at the thought of this meeting was simply lingering concern for the company's legal exposure, nothing more personal than that. Celine arrived at Ashford Tower, dressed specifically to command attention, her presence as carefully calculated as it had always been. She met Kaylin in a private conference room, and within just a few minutes, attempted to convince him that she had possessed absolutely no knowledge of her own family's extensive financial dealings, insisting she had been just as much a victim of their manipulation as Ashford Holdings itself had been. Kaylin listened carefully, watching her expression closely for the genuine sincerity he once would have taken entirely at face value, back when the powerful mate bond had clouded every single judgment he made about her. He found absolutely none of that claimed sincerity now. He told her plainly that the ongoing investigation had already uncovered clear evidence suggesting her direct personal involvement in at least 2 of the fraudulent transfers, evidence that would prove genuinely difficult for any court to reasonably dismiss as simple ignorance. Celine's careful composure faltered visibly, and she quickly shifted her approach, appealing instead to the bond they had once supposedly shared, insisting that whatever her family had actually done, what had existed between the 2 of them personally had been entirely real. Kaylin considered her desperate words carefully before finally responding. He told her, with a calm steadiness that genuinely surprised even himself, that he no longer trusted the mate bond to reliably tell him anything true about his own heart. He explained that he had learned, through considerable painful experience, that a bond built on entirely manufactured circumstances could not be trusted simply because it had felt so undeniable in the original moment. He excused himself from the meeting shortly afterward, leaving Celine alone in the conference room with absolutely nothing left to genuinely offer him. Word of the meeting reached Elena within the hour, though not through Kaylin directly. Grace, who had been closely monitoring the ongoing investigation, informed her that Celine had been seen leaving the building visibly upset, and that legal counsel now believed her direct involvement in the fraud was essentially confirmed beyond reasonable doubt. Elena processed this information with the same professional detachment she applied to every routine update, though she noticed, with some private discomfort, exactly how much lighter she genuinely felt once she understood the meeting had ended, without any meaningful reconciliation between them. That same evening, Kalen sought Elena out, not specifically to discuss the ongoing investigation, but because he needed, more than almost anything else, to speak with someone who genuinely understood exactly how thoroughly he had been deceived. He found her reviewing quarterly reports quietly in her office, and he asked, with unusual gentleness, if she had a few spare minutes to talk. She set aside her work and listened patiently as he recounted the entire conversation with Celine, watching the visible exhaustion in his eyes deepen noticeably with every additional detail he shared. When he finally finished, he admitted something he had never actually said aloud to anyone before, not even to Owen. He told Elena that he had spent 5 entire years genuinely believing the mate bond had chosen correctly, that leaving her alone on their wedding night had been an unavoidable consequence of forces considerably older and stronger than his own personal will. Learning that the entire devastating situation had been carefully engineered from the very start, by his own mother, and by Celine's family, working together in some capacity, forced him to finally confront a difficult truth he had avoided facing for far too long. He had made a genuine choice that particular night, 5 years earlier. The bond may have pulled powerfully at him, but the actual decision to walk away from Elena, to leave her standing completely alone, without a single word of explanation, had ultimately been his own choice to make. No amount of manipulation from his mother, or from Celine's family, could ever fully erase that personal responsibility. Elena listened to this raw admission in complete silence, feeling something shift unexpectedly inside her that she had not fully anticipated. For 5 long years, she had told herself that Kalen's abandonment had been driven entirely by forces beyond his personal control, a fact that made the resulting pain no less real, but somehow made it easier to categorize, easier to file away, as something that had simply happened to her, rather than something anyone had genuinely and deliberately chosen. Hearing him finally claim full responsibility for his own choice, without offering any excuse or deflection, cracked something open inside her that she had spent 5 careful years keeping tightly sealed shut. She told him, her voice quieter than she had intended, that she genuinely appreciated his complete honesty, and that she needed some real time to think carefully about what it truly meant. Kalen nodded in understanding, and did not push her for more than she felt willing to give in that moment. He left her office that particular night, carrying a strange, unfamiliar mixture of relief and genuine vulnerability, having finally spoken aloud the difficult truth he had actively avoided for 5 long years. Over the following days, Kalen confronted his mother directly, demanding to know the complete extent of her involvement in the events that had led directly to his abandoned wedding night. Vivian resisted at first, deflecting his pointed questions with the same practiced authority she had used for decades to control nearly every aspect of pack business. But Kalen, genuinely emboldened by everything Elena's return had forced him to seriously reconsider, refused to back down from his demands this time. He learned, in a conversation that ultimately left him deeply shaken, that his mother had deliberately arranged for false information about a supposed fated mate bond with Celine, to reach him on the exact night of his wedding, timed with precision, to pull him away from Elena before their marriage could solidify into anything genuinely permanent. Vivian admitted, without displaying much real remorse, that she had never truly approved of the political marriage to Elena, believing the entire Voss family carried no real value to offer the proud Ashford legacy. She had used Celine's ambitious family, who harbored their own considerable ambitions toward Ashford Holdings, to engineer a convenient distraction, never once anticipating how thoroughly it would eventually unravel the very company she claimed to be genuinely protecting. Kalen stood in his mother's private study, absorbing the full devastating weight of her betrayal, and felt something inside him finally harden into a resolve he had never before fully possessed. He told her, quietly but with unmistakable firmness, that her authority over pack matters and company decisions would end effective immediately, and that he would no longer allow her manipulations to shape the course of either his own life or the lives of anyone else connected meaningfully to him. Vivian's continued protests fell entirely on ears that no longer listened to her at all. Kaylin left her study that evening and drove immediately to Elena's apartment, arriving completely unannounced for the very first time since her return to his life. Elena opened the door, genuinely surprised, and listened carefully as he recounted everything his mother had finally confessed, his voice raw, with an anger and grief that had clearly been building steadily for 5 long years. Before he had arrived, Elena had spent the evening alone, sorting through old boxes she had never fully unpacked since moving into her current apartment, boxes that still held remnants of her earliest years in the city. She had found, near the bottom of one box, a photograph of herself and Margaret Doyle standing outside the laundromat, taken by a customer with an old camera during her 2nd year of working there. She had been staring at that photograph, remembering the exhausted, hopeful young woman in it, when Kaylin's knock startled her out of the memory entirely. She set the photograph aside on her kitchen counter before answering the door, not yet realizing how fitting it was that a reminder of exactly how far she had traveled should be sitting nearby during the very conversation that would finally begin closing the distance between her past and her present. She invited him inside, and for the very first time since the devastating wedding night that had shattered both their lives, they sat together without the armor of business obligations or careful professional distance, simply 2 people processing the full scope of a betrayal that had cost them both far more than either of them had truly understood until this moment. Elena's apartment remained quiet, except for the low, steady hum of the city outside her window. Kaylin sat across from her on a simple couch, his hands clasped tightly together, still fully processing the conversation with his mother that had completely upended everything he believed about the last 5 years of his life. Elena listened as he spoke, offering no interruptions, simply allowing him the space to work through the full weight of what he had just learned. When he finally fell silent, she poured them both a glass of water, a small gesture that felt considerably more intimate than it perhaps should have, given everything that still separated them. She told him, carefully, that she believed him completely, that she now understood clearly the genuine difference between what circumstances had forced upon him and what he had ultimately chosen freely. She said this not to excuse the pain of that terrible wedding night, but because she recognized, finally and fully, that holding on to anger toward a version of events that had never been entirely true would only keep her permanently trapped in the same hallway she had walked out of 5 years earlier. Kaylin looked at her with an expression she had not witnessed from him since their original wedding day, something raw and completely unguarded, entirely without the calculation that so often colored interactions among wolves of his particular standing. He told her that he did not genuinely expect forgiveness, and that he had not come to her apartment specifically seeking it out. He had come because she was the only person in his entire life who had ever told him the complete truth without softening it for his personal comfort, and he needed that particular honesty now, more than ever before. Elena considered his words carefully for a long moment before finally responding. She told him that forgiveness was not something she could offer easily, not after 5 entire years spent rebuilding herself from absolutely nothing, but that she no longer genuinely wanted to carry the anger as a weapon between them either. She said she was willing to let the painful past simply exist as something that had happened to both of them, rather than something that would continue to define either of their futures going forward. It was not, in itself, a full declaration of love, and both of them understood that clearly. But it represented the first genuinely honest acknowledgement either of them had allowed themselves since her return, and it quietly and permanently changed something meaningful between them. Over the following weeks, their evolving relationship shifted in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. The rigid professional distance Elena had carefully maintained since the merger began, softening gradually, not dramatically, but through small, genuinely meaningful ways. She allowed herself to eat lunch with him occasionally, to discuss matters extending beyond spreadsheets and legal filings, to laugh, on increasingly rare occasions, at something he said without immediately retreating behind her usual practiced composure. Kaylin, for his part, worked diligently to prove through consistent action, rather than empty words, that he had genuinely and permanently changed. He deferred to her professional judgment on company matters without any wounded ego, supported her difficult decisions publicly, even when doing so cost him personally, and never once pressured her to move faster than she felt genuinely ready to move. He understood, On some level he could not fully articulate even to himself that trust rebuilt through consistent behavior over meaningful time meant considerably more than any single grand romantic gesture ever truly could. Meanwhile, the formal legal case against Celine's extended family moved steadily forward toward resolution. Investigators uncovered additional compelling evidence linking Celine directly to the fraud, evidence that made her earlier claims of complete ignorance essentially impossible to sustain any longer. She was formally charged within a single month, and the resulting public scandal effectively destroyed whatever remained of her family's standing within established pack circles. Kaylin felt absolutely no genuine satisfaction in her eventual downfall, only a quiet, steady relief that the truth had finally come fully to light after years of carefully hidden manipulation. Vivian Ashford, now stripped entirely of her authority within the company, and increasingly isolated within pack leadership circles, retreated from public pack life almost completely. Kaylin visited her occasionally afterward, more out of a lingering sense of familial obligation than any genuine remaining warmth, but he made unmistakably clear that her influence over his decisions, both personal and professional, had ended permanently and completely. Elena, watching this significant transformation unfold from the sidelines, recognized in Kaylin a genuine strength she had not fully believed him capable of possessing 5 years earlier: the willingness to hold the people he loved fully accountable, even when doing so cost him deeply on a personal level. In the days following his mother's confession, Kaylin made a point of formally introducing Elena to several of the pack's younger elders during a quiet dinner at his own home, no longer the manor where their marriage had first collapsed, but a smaller house he had purchased shortly after taking full control of his own affairs. The evening was cautious at first, several of the elders clearly uncertain how to treat a woman who was technically still Kaylin's wife in the eyes of pack law, and yet who ran his family's company as an entirely separate, powerful entity in her own right. But Elena's composure, combined with her evident command of Ashford Holdings' recovery, gradually won over even the most skeptical among them. One elder, an elderly woman named Helen Marsh who had known Kaylin since he was a child, told Elena quietly near the end of the evening that she had rarely seen a human hold her own so completely in a room full of wolves, and that whatever the future held for her and Kaylin, she hoped Elena understood she had already earned a place among them through strength alone, regardless of any title. Elena thanked her, genuinely moved, though she said nothing about how foreign that kind of acceptance still felt after 5 years of believing she belonged nowhere at all. The peace that had settled between Elena and Kaylin did not last particularly long before an entirely new complication arrived unexpectedly. A pack elder named Nathan Cole, one of the last remaining allies Vivian had carefully cultivated over the years, requested an emergency gathering of the full territorial council, invoking an obscure legal clause in old pack law that Elena had never once encountered during her thorough research into the original marriage contract. The obscure clause allowed a pack council to formally nullify any business arrangement tied to an unresolved marital bond if the council determined that the arrangement genuinely threatened the overall stability of pack leadership. Nathan, acting quietly on Vivian's behalf despite her official removal from company matters, argued that Elena's controlling stake in Ashford Holdings represented exactly this kind of serious threat, since the marriage dissolution Kaylin had filed weeks earlier had not yet been formally recognized by the full council. Elena received word of this new challenge through Grace, who had heard persistent rumors circulating among the company's legal team. She immediately called Kaylin, and together they carefully reviewed the specific clause with a specialist in pack law that Owen had personally recommended, a careful and experienced woman named Diane Foster, who had spent decades successfully navigating the complicated intersection between pack tradition and modern business contracts. Diane confirmed that the clause was indeed real, though rarely invoked in the modern era, and that Nathan's formal challenge, if ultimately successful, could genuinely force a complete review of Voss Dynamics' ownership stake, potentially unraveling months of careful and painstaking restructuring work. Elena listened to this troubling news with the same composed focus she brought to every crisis she faced, though internally, she recognized clearly the deeper threat this particular challenge posed, not merely to her business interests, but to the fragile trust she and Kaylin had spent weeks carefully rebuilding together. She had anticipated legal challenges from the very beginning of this arrangement, but she had not specifically anticipated one rooted so directly in pack tradition. a complex system she still understood only partially despite her years technically married into it. She told Kaylin honestly that she needed his guidance to successfully navigate a council hearing she had never properly prepared for, and he assured her, with a conviction that genuinely surprised them both, that he would stand firmly beside her through every single step of the difficult process ahead. The council hearing was scheduled for the following week, giving Elena and Kaylin very little time to properly prepare a solid defense. Diane worked closely with them both, carefully explaining the intricate details of PAC law that govern such disputes, while Elena simultaneously continued managing the ongoing fraud case against Celine's family, absolutely refusing to let one crisis distract meaningfully from the other. During this genuinely stressful period, Elena discovered something that would ultimately prove crucial to their defense. While reviewing old PAC records carefully, with Diane's expert help, she found documentation from several decades earlier, showing that similar business arrangements tied to unresolved marriages had previously been upheld by the council, provided the business itself operated independently of any personal marital dispute. This precedent was exactly what they genuinely needed, and Elena spent the following days building a comprehensive case around it, with the same relentless precision she applied to every business challenge she faced. Kaylin, meanwhile, worked diligently to shore up support among council members who had not yet aligned themselves firmly with Nathan's challenge. He met privately with several respected elders, including some who had personally known his father and grandfather, reminding them clearly of Ashford Holdings' near-total collapse before Elena's crucial intervention and the remarkable recovery that had followed under her steady leadership. He spoke with a conviction and clarity that genuinely surprised even those who had known him for many years, no longer the young alpha who had once let his mother's ambitions dictate the entire course of his life. The night before the scheduled hearing, Elena and Kaylin reviewed their complete case one final time in her office, the same room where so much of their fragile trust had been carefully rebuilt over the past several months. Elena admitted, quietly, that she felt more genuinely nervous about this particular hearing than any business negotiation she had faced in 5 entire years, because this time, the stakes extended well beyond simple profit and loss, into territory she still did not fully understand. Kaylin reassured her firmly, telling her that regardless of whatever the council ultimately decided, he would never again allow the Ashford name to be used as a weapon against her. He told her that whatever happened the following day, he intended to stand publicly by her side, not merely as a business partner, but as someone who had come to care for her, far beyond the original boundaries of their business arrangement. Elena did not respond with words. She simply reached across the desk for his hand, the same gesture he had offered her weeks earlier, and held it firmly, drawing genuine strength from the quiet certainty visible in his eyes. The council hearing took place in a grand hall Elena had never once entered before, filled with elders and PAC leaders from territories scattered across the entire region, each one watching the proceedings with sharp, carefully assessing eyes. Nathan Cole presented his formal challenge with practiced confidence, framing Elena's ownership as an unresolved threat to overall PAC stability, carefully never mentioning Vivian's direct involvement, though everyone present in the room clearly understood exactly whose interests he truly represented. When it finally came time for Elena to respond, she rose and addressed the entire council, with the same composed authority she brought to every boardroom, laying out the legal precedent Diane had carefully helped her uncover, walking the assembled elders methodically through Ashford Holdings' complete financial turnaround under her leadership, and demonstrating clearly that the business arrangement operated entirely independent of any personal matter between herself and Kaylin. Kaylin spoke next, addressing the assembled council not as the Alpha King defending his own personal interests, but as someone finally willing to take full accountability for the events of 5 years earlier. He told the gathered elders the complete, true story of that devastating wedding night, the careful manipulation, orchestrated by his own mother, and the years of guilt he had carried ever since. He told them that Elena Voss had rebuilt not only his company, but her own entire life, from absolutely nothing, without any meaningful assistance from the very PAC that had once cruelly cast her aside, and that any attempt now to strip her of what she had rightfully and completely earned would represent exactly the kind of injustice PAC law was originally meant to prevent, not enable. The hall fell completely silent as he finished speaking. The council deliberated for what felt like several hours, though it was likely no more than 30 minutes in reality, before finally returning with their decision. They ruled firmly in Elena's favor, citing the precedent she had presented, and dismissing Nathan's challenge entirely, as an attempt to misuse pack tradition for personal and political gain, rather than any genuine concern for pack stability. Nathan left the hall in visible frustration, and word soon reached Elena that Vivian, upon hearing news of the council's final decision, had withdrawn entirely from any further attempt to challenge her position, finally recognizing that her influence over both her son and his company had ended permanently and completely. Outside the hall, as the crowd of elders slowly dispersed into the cool evening air, Kaelin turned to Elena and asked, quietly, if she truly understood what he had meant when he spoke earlier about caring for her, far beyond the boundaries of their original arrangement. Elena, exhausted but feeling lighter than she had in years, told him that she understood completely, and that for the very first time since her return, she was finally ready to explore what that might genuinely mean for both of them together. In the weeks following the council hearing, life at Ashford Holdings gradually settled into a steady rhythm neither Elena nor Kaelin had genuinely experienced since long before the devastating wedding night that had changed absolutely everything between them. The company's finances continued strengthening steadily under Elena's careful leadership. Investors regained complete confidence in the business, and the fraud case against Celine and her extended family moved steadily toward final resolution, with early indications strongly suggesting a conviction was genuinely likely. Elena and Kaelin's relationship deepened gradually and carefully, without the rushed intensity that might have easily undone the fragile trust they had worked so hard to build together. They began spending quiet evenings together outside the office, walking together through the very city Elena had rebuilt her entire life within, sharing stories from the many years they had spent apart from each other. Kaelin learned about Margaret Doyle and the small laundromat that had given Elena her very first foothold in the human world after everything fell apart. Elena learned about Owen's unwavering loyalty through years of difficult pack turmoil, and about the quiet, persistent grief Kaelin had carried, genuinely believing he had lost any real chance at happiness the moment he walked away from her 5 years earlier. Grace Bennett, watching this remarkable transformation unfold from her position within the company, once remarked quietly to Owen that she had never once seen Elena Voss allow herself to become this genuinely unguarded around anyone, not once in the 2 full years she had worked closely beside her. Owen agreed readily, noting that Kaelin too seemed to have shed years of accumulated emotional weight, walking through the office each morning now with a lightness that had been entirely absent during his difficult years chasing a mate bond that had never truly been meant for him at all. Not everyone welcomed this new chapter of their lives easily or without reservation. Victor Lang, though he had genuinely come to respect Elena's steady leadership, expressed quiet concern to Kaelin about the optics of a personal relationship developing between the Alpha King and the CEO who controlled a majority stake in his own company. Kaelin listened to this concern respectfully, but told Victor plainly that he had spent years allowing others to dictate the entire course of his personal life, and that he had absolutely no intention of repeating that particular mistake, now that he had finally found something genuinely worth protecting and fighting for. Elena, for her part, approached the steadily growing relationship with the same careful deliberation she applied to every major decision throughout her life. She insisted on maintaining clear boundaries between their personal relationship and the formal business arrangement that governed Ashford Holdings, working closely with Diane Foster to formalize protocols that would prevent any future challenge from questioning the legitimacy of Voss Dynamics' ownership stake. She was simply not willing to let her heart create new vulnerabilities that could once again cost her everything she had worked so hard to build. One quiet evening, as autumn slowly settled over the city, Kaelin invited Elena to dinner at a peaceful restaurant far removed from the tower, where they spent most of their waking hours together, insisting the entire evening remain completely free of any business discussion whatsoever. Elena agreed, genuinely curious about the unusual formality evident in his careful request, though she said nothing aloud about the small flutter of nervousness it quietly stirred within her chest. Over dinner, Kaelin spoke openly about their shared future, in a way he had carefully avoided since her return, uncertain until this moment whether such intimate conversations would even be welcome. He told her that he had spent the past several months proving, through consistent action rather than empty promises, that he had genuinely become someone worthy of a real second chance. He told her he fully understood if she still needed more time before trusting him completely with her heart again, but that he wanted her to know clearly and without any ambiguity that his feelings for her were no longer tangled up in guilt or simple obligation. He loved her, he said plainly, not out of any duty to correct the mistakes of the past, but because of exactly who she had become, through the many years she spent rebuilding herself completely without him. Elena listened to this heartfelt declaration with an emotion she had not fully allowed herself to feel completely in 5 entire years. A fragile hope she had spent so long carefully guarding against, precisely because hope, once broken, proved so genuinely difficult to trust again. She told him honestly that she had spent years convincing herself she needed absolutely no one, that her hard-won success and independence were entirely enough to fill whatever void his original abandonment had carved permanently into her life. She told him that meeting him again, watching him genuinely change through consistent effort rather than empty words, had forced her to seriously reconsider that deeply held belief, in ways she had never fully expected. She did not offer him a complete declaration of love in return, not quite yet. But she told him, with a quiet sincerity that meant considerably more to him than any grand romantic gesture ever could have, that she genuinely wanted to continue building whatever this steadily growing connection was between them, slowly and honestly, without either of them rushing toward promises neither felt fully ready to keep just yet. Kaylin accepted this measured response with the same patience he had shown consistently throughout their months of careful rebuilding, understanding clearly that Elena's caution was not any form of rejection, but rather the entirely natural instinct of someone who had learned, through genuinely painful experience, to protect herself carefully from being hurt, in exactly the same devastating way twice. As the fraud case against Celine's family finally reached its conclusion in the following weeks, resulting in significant legal penalties and the effective, total collapse of the Marlowe family's standing within PAC circles, Kaylin felt a final difficult chapter of his troubled past finally close completely. He visited his mother one last time, before she withdrew entirely from public PAC life, telling her plainly that he had chosen deliberately to build his future around honesty and personal accountability, principles she had genuinely never modeled for him throughout his life, and that he hoped, in time, she might eventually learn to understand exactly why that mattered so deeply to him now. Vivian offered no genuine apology in response, clinging still stubbornly to her belief that her actions, however painful, had been fundamentally intended to protect the PAC's broader interests. Kaylin left that difficult conversation without lingering anger, only a quiet acceptance that some relationships simply could not be fully repaired, and that he no longer needed his mother's approval to feel genuinely secure in the choices he had ultimately made for himself. Elena, watching Kaylin navigate this final, difficult reckoning with his mother, found herself genuinely proud of the man he had steadily become, not despite the serious mistakes of his troubled past, but precisely because of how thoroughly he had chosen to confront and correct them. She realized, sitting beside him one quiet evening in her own apartment, that the protective wall she had spent 5 entire years building carefully around her heart had crumbled almost completely, not through any single dramatic moment, but through the slow, steady accumulation of 1,000 small proofs that this particular man had genuinely and permanently changed. She told him this, finally, one quiet evening as they sat together watching the city lights slowly flicker on below her apartment window. She told him that she loved him too, not the careless boy who had once left her standing completely alone on their wedding night, but the genuinely changed man who had spent the past several months earning back, piece by careful piece, everything he had once so carelessly thrown away. Kaylin pulled her close, and for the very first time since that devastating night 5 long years earlier, Elena allowed herself to believe, fully and without any lingering reservation, that she had finally found the true home she had spent so long carefully building for herself, both within her own hard-won success and within the arms of a man who had genuinely proven himself worthy of her complete trust. Late in the winter, before spring finally arrived, Elena returned to the old apartment above Margaret Doyle's laundromat for the first time in years, drawn back by an impulse she did not fully examine until she was already standing outside the familiar door. Margaret, older now, but still sharp-eyed and steady, greeted her with open arms and insisted on making tea the way she always had, in the same chipped kettle Elena remembered from her earliest, hardest days in the city. Elena told her everything that had happened over the past several months, the merger, the fraud, the slow rebuilding of trust with Kaylin. and Margaret listened with the quiet patience of someone who had watched this particular young woman grow from nothing into someone remarkable. When Elena finished, Margaret told her plainly that she had always known Elena would find her way to something extraordinary, not because of luck, but because she had never once, in all the years Margaret had known her, allowed a single hardship to convince her she was finished. Elena left that evening with a lightness in her chest she had not expected, understanding fully, for perhaps the first time, that the people who had helped her survive her lowest years deserved to witness her happiest ones as well. Spring arrived in the city with a warmth that felt, to Elena, like an entirely new beginning altogether. Ashford Holdings had fully recovered from the serious crisis that once threatened to destroy it completely, standing now as one of the most stable and genuinely respected companies in the entire region. Its remarkable recovery widely credited to the partnership between Elena Voss and Kaylin Ashford, a story that had, in the months since the fraud case finally concluded, become something of a genuine legend within both the business world and PAC circles alike. Elena had not expected, when she first walked back into that boardroom 8 months earlier, that she would ultimately find anything beyond a sound business opportunity waiting for her there. Yet here she now was, sitting across from Kaylin at breakfast, in the home they now genuinely shared together, a home that neither Ashford Manor's lingering shadow, nor the painful memory of that devastating wedding night, could ever fully touch again. Kaylin had spent the entire winter months carefully rebuilding PAC leadership structures completely from the ground up, ensuring that no single individual, not even himself, could ever again wield the kind of unchecked authority his own mother had used to orchestrate so much lasting pain. He worked closely with Victor Lang, who had become an unlikely but genuinely steady ally, and with several younger elders, eager to modernize old traditions that had, for generations, prioritized political convenience over genuine personal well-being. Elena, meanwhile, continued expanding Voss Dynamics well beyond just Ashford Holdings, taking on new struggling companies, with the same relentless dedication that had defined her entire rise from a small laundromat backroom to the head of a genuinely respected business empire. She hired Margaret Doyle's grandson as an intern that particular spring, a quiet gesture of genuine gratitude toward the woman who had given her a real chance when she had nothing else left in the world, and she made a deliberate point of mentoring young employees who reminded her of the determined, exhausted young woman she herself had once been. One afternoon, as cherry blossoms scattered gently across the courtyard outside Ashford Tower, Kaylin asked Elena to meet him there during her lunch break, refusing to explain exactly why over the phone. She arrived to find him waiting patiently beneath the largest tree in the courtyard, dressed simply, entirely without any of the formal trappings of his significant alpha title. He told her, without any ceremony or grand rehearsed speeches, that he genuinely wanted to marry her again, not out of political necessity or old PAC tradition, but because he wanted the entire world, both human and wolf alike, to witness a promise made completely freely and entirely, in a way their original first wedding never truly had been. He knelt before her right there in the courtyard, surrounded by curious employees who paused their lunch breaks to watch quietly, and asked her to become his wife, not as any kind of formality, but as the truest and most genuine choice he had ever made in his entire life. Elena, standing beneath the gently scattering blossoms with a smile she no longer bothered to hide from anyone, said yes, without a single moment of hesitation, understanding fully, for the very first time in her entire life, that some promises were genuinely worth trusting completely. Their second wedding took place several months later, in early summer, in a peaceful garden Elena herself had personally chosen, far removed from the cold formality of Ashford Manor. Grace Bennett served proudly as her closest attendant, alongside Margaret Doyle, who cried openly through most of the short, heartfelt ceremony. Owen Blake stood loyally beside Kaylin, having personally witnessed every single step of his remarkable transformation over the preceding year, and Victor Lang, once a genuine skeptic of Elena's leadership, offered a warm toast at the reception afterward, praising her as the finest business mind the PAC had seen in an entire generation. Vivian Ashford was not invited to the ceremony, though Kaylin sent word that she would always remain welcome to reach out if she ever genuinely chose to acknowledge the real harm her actions had caused. She never did reach out, choosing instead to remain in quiet isolation, a fact that no longer carried the power to wound her son the way it once certainly might have. As the ceremony reached its heartfelt close, Kaylin took Elena's hands gently in his own, echoing words nearly identical to the ones spoken 5 entire years earlier, except this time, every single syllable carried the true weight of a promise both of them fully intended to keep for the rest of their lives. He told her, in front of everyone who genuinely mattered most to them both, that he would never again let her stand completely alone, that the home they had built together, brick by careful brick, belonged equally to both of them now, forged not through political convenience, but through mutual respect, hard-earned trust, and a love that had genuinely survived the worst betrayal either of them had ever personally known. Elena, holding her father's locket in one hand and Kaylin's steady hand in the other, felt the final remnants of the deep wound that had shaped so much of her difficult life finally begin to heal completely. She thought, briefly, of the folded note still resting quietly in a drawer in her office desk, the one she had never quite managed to throw away entirely. She decided, standing there in the warm golden light of that beautiful summer evening, that she finally understood exactly why she had kept it all those years, not as any painful reminder of past hurt, but as genuine proof of exactly how far she had traveled to arrive at this precious moment, whole, deeply respected, and completely, unshakably loved. That evening, as the last of their gathered guests finally departed, and the peaceful garden grew quiet beneath a canopy of bright stars, Elena and Kaylin stood together, in exactly the place where their entirely new beginning had started. Neither the careless alpha king who once abandoned a bride, nor the broken young woman he left behind, but two people who had genuinely rebuilt themselves, separately, and then finally together, into something far stronger than either of them had ever been alone. The Alpha King had once abandoned her on their wedding night. 5 years later, she had walked back into his life, as his boss, his true equal, and finally, entirely by her own free choice, his wife. Not because fate had ever demanded it of either of them, but because both of them, at long last, had genuinely chosen each other freely, completely, and forever.